Hey everyone, I'm the web dev tech lead, and today we're going to convert a React class component into a functional component using hooks. Now this video assumes you already have a basic understanding of both React and modern JavaScript. What we have here is a basic app that lists the first 151 Pokemon and allows the user to search for Pokemon in the list by name. For example, typing PIK filters the list to Pikachu. We will be using the pokeapi to fetch the Pokemon. Now let's get started. Starting off in the app.js, we can see we just have an h1 tag that says gotta list them all and our Pokemon list component. This is the one we're going to be refactoring. In our Pokemon list class component, we're going to start by looking at the constructor. In the constructor, we receive props and then call super with the props. Next, we set the initial value for state, Pokemon being an empty array and search an empty string. Then we call fetch data. In the fetch data function, we make the get request to the pokeapi. When the request resolves, we take the results and call setState to update the Pokemon. After fetch data, we create a ref. We'll get back into this a little later. Now let's take a look at the render method. Here we are creating a constant called Pokemon list. This is our filtered list of Pokemon based on what the user searched. Moving on to the JSX being returned, we can see there are essentially two sections, the search and the list. The search is an input with the ref we created earlier and an onChange function to handle updating the state based on the user input. Finally, let's take a look at the component didMount lifecycle method. Here, all we are doing is taking the ref, which is the input component, and focusing it. By doing this, we allow the user to start typing into the input component right away, saving them the need to click inside the input. Now let's get started on the refactor. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to remove the imports we no longer need. Now I'm going to get rid of class, make it a const, because this is a function, and we're going to use an arrow function. Let's get rid of this, equals props. Now, since we're not actually going to use props, I can go ahead and just get rid of it. Now, let's move inside. So first thing we could do, we can get rid of the constructor here, we don't need it, and props, we don't need it. Now we're left with state. Before hooks, we would have no choice but to keep this a class component. But now with hooks, we can go ahead and import the useState hook. As the name suggests, this allows us to use state. So I'm going to make a new const, let's call it Pokemon state. And we're going to set it equal to useState, and this is a function, so we're going to call it. Now useState gets the initial value as an argument. So here, I want Pokemon to be initially an empty array. So we'll do that. Great. So now how do we use this thing? Well, what useState returns is actually an array. What's in the 0th spot is the actual value, and what's in the 1 spot is a function to update the value. So it would look something like this. Const Pokemon equals Pokemon state 0. And const, let's call this set Pokemon. And this is going to be Pokemon state 1. Now, in modern JavaScript, we can do something called array destructuring. What this allows us to do is very similar to object destructuring, but within an array. So we can just go ahead, put our little square brackets here, and whatever we want to call the value in the 0th spot, we do that here, and we can do set Pokemon. This is the exact same thing as before when this was Pokemon state, and then we just went and got what's in the 0 spot and what's in the 1 spot. Just a lot more compact. So let's go ahead and get rid of these. Great. Now let's do the same thing for search. So I'm just going to copy this line. Search starts off as an empty string. We'll call this set search. Oops. And we'll call this search. Great. So now we can get rid of this. Now I'm going to skip fetch data for the moment, and let's move on to the ref. So for refs, there's another hook we can call useRef. And this one's pretty straightforward. We're going to make a const, call it ref, and set it equal to ref, which is also a function. Great. So now we can get rid of this line. Now fetch data. This is something we only want to run on the very first time. This is why originally it was in the constructor. But if we were to leave this as it is right now, what would happen is when the component mounts, we'll call fetch data. Fetch data will make the request, and then it'll update state, which will cause the component to re-render. By doing so though, we'll call fetch data again, which again will make the request and again set state and again cause the component to re-render. This is an infinite loop and we don't want that. So to stop our component from going into an infinite loop, let's use useEffect. useEffect is a really cool hook because it allows us to pass it a function as an argument. So let's give it a function that will only be called if something in its list of dependencies changes. So what does that mean? Here in this second argument, I'm passing it in an empty array. Now, in some cases, you may pass in several values here. Maybe there's something from props, maybe it's something else in state. And what happens is if any one of those values change, useEffect will call the function you passed it. In our case though, we actually never want this to be called again, only on the very first render. So I'm gonna pass it an empty array, basically telling the useEffect, hey, only on the mount do I ever want you calling fetch data. So I removed the this because it's no longer in a class and we're good to go. So now let's move on to the component did mount. So we can use useEffect again. We can actually use as many as we'd like. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and move this in here. Instead of this.ref, it's just gonna be ref, because that's the ref that we have here in line 7. And we're gonna focus it. Now, this useEffect, we're actually gonna give it a dependency of ref. The reason we're gonna do this is because we want this function to run every time the ref changes. Imagine a situation where the ref changes to a different component, and now we would want that component to be focused. If that were the case, once ref is updated, this useEffect would be called again. So moving on, let's go ahead and get rid of this old code. Now let's make this a const. The only thing in fetch data that needs to change is how we're setting the Pokemon state. So instead of calling this.setState, we're now going to call setPokemon. And we just pass it the result. Great. Let's move on to the onChange. Again, let's make this a const. And again, the only real change here is how we set state. So instead of this.setState, it's going to be setSearch. And we just pass it e.target.value, .2 lowercase. Oops. Great, so we're almost there. Render, we can get rid of this. And let's get rid of the curly down there. Let's indent this all over. All right, so instead of this.state.pokemon, it's just Pokemon. And instead of this.state.search, it's just search. Down here, get rid of this and get rid of this. And that's it. Let's take a look. So as you can see on refresh, our input is still focused, so I can type right away. Get Pikachu, Charmander. And that's all there is to it. So everything you could do in a class component, you can now do in a functional component, thanks to hooks. So let me guess. Your question is, why do all of this? It doesn't look any more compact. It doesn't look even that much easier to read. And in fact, maybe you feel comfortable with the pattern of class components. Why go this route? Well, I'll admit, this example is not the best for showing off the power of hooks. It's just a great one to get started. Hooks really become powerful when you can replace higher order components with them. For example, let's pretend you were using React Router and you needed to use the with router higher order component. So you add that and now you have history in your props. Great. Maybe you're using GraphQL as well and you need to use the GraphQL higher order component. Now also in your props is client and query and mutation. Great. So all that's in your props. What tends to happen is you add more and more and more of these, what's actually in your props is becoming less and less obvious. The problem is, as this grows and you have more and more higher order components, it may be pretty tough to tell where your props are coming from. Now, a lot of these libraries have started to implement hooks, so you can import for React Router, use history or use location. And now it's very clear where that's coming from. Or Apollo client, you can use query and use mutation. It really helps to clarify the code, and it's great to be able to get rid of these higher order components. This was just a quick lesson today. There's still plenty more hooks to learn and start to use, but this is a great intro to how you can take most of your basic class components and convert them into functional components. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe.